Officer, everything is in order. Veterans card, disabled permit, everything is in order. I've been a patient here for 20 years.
These plates are all fake. Show me your papers, quick.
Cop mocked a disabled vet and towed his van. 5 minutes later, Marines blocked every exit. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison wheeled his chair up to the familiar handicap space at the Phoenix VA Medical Center at 1100 on Thursday morning, his Purple Heart license plate gleaming in the desert sun. In 12 minutes, when Officer Bradley Kane decided to mock a disabled Marine and tow his wheelchair-accessible van, 23 members of 2nd Battalion would show him what happens when you dishonor the Brotherhood. Frank, 68, appears to be exactly what his wheelchair and VA appointment suggest, an aging, disabled veteran whose quiet dignity masks the warrior he once was. But beneath his civilian clothes lies a decorated Marine whose sacrifice in Vietnam earned him medals and a brotherhood that never abandons its own, no matter the cost. What happened in that parking lot would prove that some bonds are unbreakable and that disrespecting one Marine means answering to them all. Phoenix VA Medical Center, a sprawling facility where thousands of veterans receive care daily while navigating parking challenges that create tension between disabled veterans' needs and officers who often lack understanding of military sacrifice. The medical center operates with complex parking regulations where handicapped spaces are precious real estate, occasionally patrolled by local police who may not recognize the significance of military license plates or the sacrifices they represent. Recent incidents throughout the country have highlighted conflicts between law enforcement and disabled veterans, where misunderstandings about legitimate handicap permits have led to public confrontations that test community respect for military service. The medical center's parking situation creates daily stress for disabled veterans whose mobility depends on accessible parking that younger officers might not fully appreciate. This setting represents the intersection where civilian authority meets military sacrifice, creating opportunities for both understanding and conflict. When respect for service members' disabilities meets bureaucratic enforcement that doesn't always account for the complexities of veteran healthcare needs and mobility challenges. Frank enlisted as an 18-year-old Marine in 1965, serving 3 tours in Vietnam, where his squad conducted reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. During his final tour in 1970, an IED explosion took both his legs below the knee while he was evacuating wounded Marines from a hot LZ near Da Nang. His actions during that mission saved 6 Marines but cost him his mobility, earning him the Purple Heart and Bronze Star, while beginning a lifetime of adapting to civilian life with prosthetics that never quite replaced what he'd lost serving his country. Frank's transition to veteran status included decades of VA appointments for prosthetic adjustments, pain management, and the psychological challenges of warrior to civilian transformation. Frank lives independently in a specially modified home, driving his wheelchair-accessible van to twice-weekly VA appointments for prosthetic maintenance and medical care that keeps him mobile and active despite his disabilities. His routine includes arriving early to secure handicap parking that accommodates his wheelchair, lift a necessity that able-bodied individuals often don't understand or respect. Frank maintains contact with Marines from his unit through social media and veteran organizations, though his quiet demeanor means most people don't realize his combat history or the extent of his service-connected disabilities. His van represents independence and dignity, making any threat to his transportation a direct challenge to the freedom he sacrificed his legs to preserve. Despite his disabilities, Frank retains the bearing and mental toughness that Marine training instilled, adapting to physical limitations while maintaining the integrity and brotherhood bonds that military service created. His greatest strength is inspiring younger veterans through quiet examples showing that disabilities don't diminish worth or capability when courage and determination persist. Frank's military experience enables him to recognize fellow veterans through subtle cues, bearing language and shared understanding of service that creates instant connections with other Marines. His presence commands respect from those who understand military culture, while his humility means he rarely discusses his combat record or decorations unless specifically asked by someone who appreciates their significance. Frank must navigate civilian spaces where his disabilities make him vulnerable to discrimination from authority figures who may not respect or understand military sacrifice while maintaining dignity despite physical limitations that make defending himself challenging. The primary obstacle is civilian ignorance about military service and disability rights, creating situations where legitimate handicap parking usage becomes questioned by officers who see only wheelchair users, rather than recognizing veterans whose disabilities resulted from serving their country. The stakes involve both personal dignity and broader veteran respect. Frank's treatment influences how other disabled veterans are perceived and accommodated, while civilian reactions determine whether military sacrifice receives appropriate recognition from communities that benefit from such service. This conflict represents the daily challenge facing disabled veterans whose visible injuries make them targets for discrimination, while their service record demands respect that civilian authority figures may not understand or provide without education about military sacrifice and veterans' rights. Frank's Thursday morning began like hundreds before it arriving at the VA Medical Center with extra time to navigate parking challenges and building access that wheelchair users required for medical appointments that kept him mobile and healthy despite service-connected disabilities. Same spot as always, Frank noted while positioning his van in the handicap space closest to the main entrance. His Purple Heart license plate and valid disability placard displayed according to regulations he'd followed religiously for 20 years of VA visits. The appointment represented routine prosthetic adjustment that prevented complications from ill-fitting artificial limbs, essential maintenance that enabled Frank's continued independence despite losing both legs while serving his country in combat operations that most civilians couldn't imagine. Officer Bradley Kane approached the parking area during his patrol shift, observing the wheelchair-accessible van with skepticism that disabled parking enforcement required vigilance against fraud, though his aggressive attitude suggested personal bias rather than professional duty. Another one claiming disability, Kane muttered while examining Frank's credentials with obvious doubt, his dismissive tone creating tension that Frank recognized from previous encounters with authority figures who questioned veterans' legitimate accommodation needs. The situation was escalating toward confrontation that would test Frank's dignity against official harassment, designed to challenge his right to parking that his military sacrifice had earned through service-connected disabilities that prosthetics couldn't completely address. Frank's approach to civilian encounters required careful balance between asserting veterans' rights and avoiding confrontations that could escalate beyond his physical ability to manage as wheelchair-bound veteran whose combat days had ended with his mobility. His strategy emphasized polite compliance with legitimate requests while maintaining dignity when officials questioned credentials or accommodation needs that federal law protected through Americans with Disabilities Act and Veterans Preference policies. Most critically, Frank prepared documentation proving disability status and vehicle registration, carrying VA identification handicap placard and military records that established his right to accessible parking despite skeptical officers who might challenge veterans' claims. His experience with discrimination taught defensive responses that protected legal rights while avoiding aggressive behavior that could justify official retaliation against disabled veterans whose physical limitations made resistance dangerous during confrontational encounters. Frank also prepared mental strategies for managing emotional triggers when civilian authority figures disrespected military service using breathing techniques and perspective that prevented anger from compromising his safety during encounters with hostile officials. His routine included arriving early for appointments to secure appropriate parking, while allowing extra time for potential delays caused by accessibility challenges or administrative complications that wheelchair users faced during medical facility navigation. Frank's entry into the medical center proceeded normally until Officer Kane approached his van with aggressive body language that suggested confrontation rather than routine parking enforcement that professional courtesy would provide to disabled veterans. License and registration, Kane demanded while examining Frank's handicap placard with exaggerated scrutiny designed to intimidate rather than verify legitimate parking credentials that clearly met legal requirements for disabled access. The interaction attracted attention from other veterans entering and leaving the medical center, several of whom recognized the developing situation as discrimination against disabled service member whose rights were being questioned without justification. "These look suspicious," Kane announced loudly while examining Frank's valid documentation, his public challenge creating humiliating spectacle designed to embarrass veteran whose parking was completely legal and appropriate for his accessibility needs. Frank's response remained calm and respectful despite Kane's provocative behavior. "Officer, my credentials are valid and current. I've parked here for 20 years without any problems." His military bearing and polite tone contrasted sharply with Kane's aggressive attitude. "We'll see about that," Kane replied, while radioing for a tow truck, his escalation indicating predetermined intent to harass the disabled veteran regardless of valid parking credentials that clearly established Frank's right to handicap space accommodation. Kane's harassment escalated when he claimed Frank's Purple Heart license plate looked fake, despite clear VA registration and valid handicap placard displayed according to regulations, creating public spectacle designed to humiliate the disabled veteran in front of other medical center visitors. His loud accusations attracted growing crowd of veterans who recognized discriminatory treatment of service member whose combat injuries were being mocked by civilian authority figure. Frank maintained dignified responses while Kane's aggressive behavior revealed personal bias against disabled veterans rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns about parking violations. The officer's disrespectful attitude toward military sacrifice offended veteran witnesses who began recording the confrontational encounter for documentation and potential legal action. The situation intensified when Kane called for tow truck, despite Frank's valid documentation claiming the wheelchair-accessible van was improperly parked in handicap space that Frank had legitimate right to occupy through federally protected disability accommodation. His decision to tow disabled veterans' primary transportation created immediate hardship for medical patient whose independence depended on vehicle access that military service had necessitated through combat injuries. Veteran witnesses began making phone calls to notify other Marines about discriminatory treatment of their brother, while Frank's calm protests were dismissed by Kane's increasingly hostile behavior toward disabled service member. The tow truck's arrival created urgency for intervention as Frank faced losing transportation essential for medical care and daily independence. Kane's mockery reached peak when he publicly ridiculed Frank's disability, making crude comments about wheelchair warriors and fake veterans that challenged the authenticity of combat injuries that had cost Frank his legs while serving his country. His verbal abuse crossed line from professional misconduct to personal attack on military service and sacrifice that veteran witnesses found unacceptable from civilian authority figure. The humiliation of decorated Marine created immediate emergency requiring intervention from military brothers who would not tolerate disrespect toward service member whose wounds had been earned protecting American freedom that Kane's behavior dishonored through discriminatory treatment. The confrontation attracted attention from VA Medical Center staff who witnessed official harassment of disabled veterans seeking medical care, creating institutional concern about patient access and dignity that civilian discrimination threatened through hostile law enforcement behavior. Social media posts by veteran witnesses began spreading information about Kane's treatment of disabled Marine, generating community outrage and calls for accountability from officials whose behavior violated both civil rights and military respect that veteran sacrifices deserved. Local news crews arrived after receiving tips about discriminatory incident documenting official misconduct while creating public scrutiny of police department whose officer was harassing decorated combat veteran during routine medical appointment. Military social networks activated as word spread about Kane's disrespectful treatment of Purple Heart recipient, generating coordinated response from Marine units whose brotherhood obligations required protecting members from civilian discrimination and official harassment. The convergence of media attention, veteran outrage, and military response created pressure for immediate resolution before Kane's misconduct could escalate further or cause additional harm to disabled veteran whose dignity and rights were being systematically violated. VA facility management faced criticism for allowing discriminatory harassment of patient in medical center parking area, where disabled veterans should receive respect and accommodation rather than official intimidation from civilian authorities abusing their positions. Facing public humiliation while managing physical vulnerability tested Frank's ability to maintain Marine dignity while protecting himself from official harassment that his wheelchair-bound condition made difficult to resist through conventional self-defense methods. Kane's discriminatory treatment forced Frank to confront civilian prejudice against disabled veterans while drawing on military training that emphasized honor and bearing under hostile conditions that required emotional discipline rather than reactive anger. His response to systematic harassment revealed character developed through military service. He maintained respectful behavior. Despite provocation, documented official misconduct through proper channels, and prioritized de-escalation over confrontation that his physical limitations made potentially dangerous. The confrontation crystallized Frank's understanding of civilian-military divide. His sacrifice meant nothing to individuals who couldn't recognize veteran dignity despite obvious evidence of service-connected disabilities requiring accommodation rather than discrimination. Frank's Marine identity strengthened under attack, reminding him that military brotherhood provided protection when civilian authorities failed to respect veteran rights or acknowledge sacrifice that his combat injuries represented. His response to Kane's harassment demonstrated that disabilities didn't diminish military bearing or reduce entitlement to respect that his service had earned, while his documentation of misconduct protected other disabled veterans from similar discrimination. As Kane's harassment escalated to vehicle impoundment, while Frank's transportation disappeared on tow truck, the situation approached crisis, where disabled veteran would be stranded without recourse against official misconduct that violated both civil rights and military respect. His growing humiliation before civilian witnesses indicated escalating emergency requiring intervention from brothers who would not tolerate systematic disrespect of Marine whose combat sacrifice deserved protection rather than persecution from authority figures abusing their positions. The tow truck's departure with Frank's wheelchair-accessible van created immediate hardship for disabled veteran whose independence and medical access had been eliminated by discriminatory enforcement that federal law prohibited against protected veterans. Kane's verbal abuse targeting Frank's military service suggested continued escalation that could include arrest or additional harassment, unless intervention occurred before official misconduct became physical confrontation that Frank's disabilities made impossible to defend against safely. Military social networks had transmitted news of discrimination incident throughout Marine community, whose response protocols required immediate support for brothers facing civilian harassment that challenged unit cohesion and military honor. The convergence of official misconduct, veteran vulnerability, and military brotherhood created perfect conditions for confrontation where Marine Corps loyalty would meet civilian authority in ways that tested both institutional respect and personal accountability. Frank's situation reached complete crisis when Kane's harassment culminated in the tow truck driving away with his wheelchair-accessible van, leaving him stranded in the medical center parking lot, while the officer smugly filled out paperwork with obvious satisfaction at having successfully humiliated a disabled Marine. Maybe next time you'll think twice before claiming benefits you don't deserve, Kane announced loudly enough for remaining witnesses to hear his words, capturing the essence of civilian prejudice against disabled veterans whose sacrifice he neither understood nor respected. The situation exploded into unprecedented confrontation when the first Marine pickup truck arrived within minutes, followed by 3 more vehicles carrying members of 2nd Battalion who had received emergency calls about their brother being harassed by civilian authority figure. "What the hell is going on here?" demanded Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez as he approached Kane with military bearing that immediately shifted power dynamics from civilian harassment to military intervention, requiring explanation and accountability. Frank faced complete breakdown of civilian protection as Kane's misconduct had eliminated his transportation while creating public humiliation that challenged both his dignity and independence that military service had cost him through combat injuries requiring accommodation rather than discrimination. The Marine response represented unprecedented civilian-military confrontation as brotherhood obligations required protecting member from official harassment, while Kane's authority position created potential for escalation that could involve arrests, media attention, and institutional conflict. That Marine earned his parking space by leaving his legs in Vietnam, Rodriguez stated, while other Marines positioned themselves around Kane in formation that communicated protective intent without threatening behavior, demonstrating military discipline under civilian provocation. Kane realized his harassment of disabled veteran had triggered response from military unit whose collective presence transformed parking lot confrontation into test of civilian authority against Marine Corps loyalty that prioritized brotherhood over civilian cooperation. Standing surrounded by Marines while his harassment of disabled veteran faced military scrutiny, Kane confronted fundamental choice between acknowledging misconduct and apologizing or escalating confrontation against military personnel whose protective response challenged his civilian authority. The safe choice was immediate de-escalation, admit error, in judgment arrange for Frank's van return, and issue public apology that acknowledged veterans' legitimate rights while accepting responsibility for discriminatory enforcement that violated both law and military respect. But Kane's personality and training made backing down difficult when surrounded by military personnel whose presence challenged his civilian authority, while his supervisor's response would determine whether official support enabled continued harassment or required accountability for civil rights violations. "This is police business, not military," Kane declared while facing Marines whose calm bearing contrasted with his obvious nervousness about confronting multiple veterans whose collective response demonstrated unit cohesion under civilian threat. His decision crystallized around authority protection, maintain official position despite obvious error, rather than acknowledge misconduct before military witnesses whose respect for disabled veteran exceeded their deference to civilian law enforcement. The ultimate stakes transcended individual confrontation to involve civilian-military relations, whether disabled veteran would receive appropriate respect and accommodation or whether official harassment would continue despite military intervention requiring escalation through command channels. Kane's choice would determine not just Frank's immediate situation, but broader precedent for civilian treatment of disabled veterans whose rights were protected by federal law, but depended on official respect that his behavior had systematically violated. The Marines' response represented test of military restraint when civilian authorities abused disabled veterans, requiring balance between protective instincts and legal compliance that training emphasized despite provocation. Kane made the choice that would transform minor harassment into major incident, continued defiance of Marine intervention, while doubling down on harassment of disabled veteran despite overwhelming evidence that his behavior violated both law and military respect. "I don't care what uniform you used to wear," Kane announced while facing Marines whose calm response demonstrated professional discipline under civilian provocation. This fake veteran was parked illegally, and his van stays impounded until he proves his disability claims. His escalation created immediate crisis, requiring command intervention as Marines' protective response met civilian authority that refused to acknowledge veterans' legitimate rights or service-connected disabilities that federal law protected. But Kane's refusal to de-escalate triggered Marine coordination that blocked all parking lot exits while maintaining legal compliance, creating non-violent demonstration of military unity that prevented his departure until resolution occurred through appropriate channels. "Nobody leaves until this gets fixed," Rodriguez announced, while Marines positioned vehicles to create peaceful blockade that ensured accountability without threatening behavior, demonstrating tactical coordination under civilian law. Kane's authority had been superseded by military brotherhood whose protective response created standoff, requiring resolution through supervisory intervention and official accountability for discriminatory harassment of disabled combat veteran. As Marines coordinated peaceful blockade of all parking lot exits while maintaining legal compliance, the situation required immediate supervisory intervention to resolve confrontation between civilian authority and military brotherhood, protecting disabled veteran from continued harassment. Kane's radio calls brought his supervising Lieutenant Davis to the scene where 23 Marines in formation created visual demonstration of military unity, while remaining within legal bounds that prevented charges of obstruction or intimidation. "What's the situation here?" Davis inquired while observing Marines whose disciplined bearing contrasted with Kane's obvious nervousness about explaining harassment of disabled veteran to supervisor who understood both civil rights law and military culture. Frank remained calm despite transportation crisis, trusting Marine brothers whose response demonstrated unit loyalty while maintaining dignity during confrontation that tested civilian respect for military sacrifice and veteran accommodation rights. The peaceful blockade attracted media attention as reporters arrived to document unprecedented civilian-military standoff involving disabled veterans' rights and official harassment that violated federal accommodation law while challenging military honor. Rodriguez coordinated Marine response through proper channels, ensuring legal compliance while demonstrating protective solidarity that communicated clear message about respecting disabled veterans regardless of civilian authority figures' personal prejudices against military service. The moment of maximum confrontation arrived as Kane faced choice between acknowledging misconduct and accepting consequences or continuing harassment, despite Marine intervention that had transformed parking lot into demonstration of military brotherhood solidarity. Officer Kane, explain your actions regarding this veteran's legal parking and vehicle impoundment, Lieutenant Davis demanded while reviewing Frank's valid documentation that clearly established legitimate handicap accommodation rights protected by federal law. Kane's attempts to justify harassment revealed personal bias rather than professional enforcement. These disability claims are mostly fraud. Someone has to check these people who think military service entitles them to special treatment. The Marines' formation tightened slightly while maintaining legal positioning, their coordinated response demonstrating unit discipline under civilian provocation that challenged both their brother and institutional respect for military sacrifice. This Marine left his legs in Vietnam defending your right to wear that badge, Rodriguez stated, while Kane realized his harassment had targeted decorated combat veteran whose sacrifice exceeded his understanding of military service. Davis's investigation revealed Kane's pattern of complaints against disabled veterans, creating personnel issue requiring immediate resolution before media coverage amplified discriminatory behavior that reflected poorly on department professionalism and community relations. The climactic confrontation reached resolution when Lieutenant Davis reviewed Frank's documentation while surrounded by Marines whose peaceful presence demonstrated military solidarity without legal violation, creating pressure for appropriate civilian response to veteran harassment. Officer Kane, this veteran's credentials are completely valid, Davis announced while examining Purple Heart license plate, VA identification, and handicap placard that clearly established Frank's right to accessible parking without question or harassment from patrol officers. His investigation revealed Kane's misconduct, while Marines maintained formation that communicated protective intent without threatening behavior, demonstrating military discipline under civilian authority while ensuring veterans' rights received appropriate recognition and respect. Frank's dignity throughout harassment impressed both his Marine brothers and civilian supervisors, proving that military bearing transcended physical disabilities, while his quiet strength inspired respect from those who understood service sacrifice. The media documentation created permanent record of both Kane's harassment and Marine response, establishing precedent for veteran protection while demonstrating military brotherhood under civilian provocation, requiring professional rather than emotional reactions. Davis's resolution attempt created immediate complications, as Kane's refusal to apologize or arrange van return indicated continued defiance despite supervisory direction and obvious evidence of discriminatory harassment against legitimate disabled veteran. "I stand by my actions," Kane declared while facing Marines whose restraint demonstrated professional military bearing despite obvious frustration with civilian authority figure who showed no respect for veteran sacrifice or federal accommodation law. His continued defiance triggered department protocols requiring internal affairs investigation, while Marines' blockade remained legal demonstration of solidarity that prevented Kane's departure until appropriate resolution occurred through official channels. Media coverage intensified as reporters documented unprecedented standoff between civilian law enforcement and military personnel, protecting disabled veteran from continued harassment by authority figure whose behavior violated both civil rights and institutional respect. The complexity of civilian military jurisdiction required careful navigation to prevent escalation while ensuring veteran received appropriate treatment and accommodation that his service had earned through combat sacrifice that Kane neither understood nor appreciated. The climactic transformation occurred when VA Medical Center Director Colonel Patterson arrived to assess situation involving disabled veteran patient whose medical access had been compromised by civilian harassment requiring institutional intervention. "This Marine has been my patient for 20 years, Patterson announced while reviewing Frank's medical records that documented service-connected disabilities requiring accommodation rather than discrimination from civilian authorities. His sacrifice earned our respect, not harassment from officers who don't understand military service." Kane's harassment faced institutional challenge from military leadership whose authority exceeded civilian patrol officer, while Patterson's intervention provided command presence that transformed confrontation into educational opportunity about veteran rights and sacrifice. Officer Kane will immediately arrange this veteran's vehicle return and issue public apology. Davis ordered, while Kane realized his misconduct had created department liability requiring immediate correction before legal action escalated discriminatory behavior into civil rights lawsuit. The Marines maintained formation while Kane contacted tow company, their disciplined presence ensuring compliance without threatening behavior that demonstrated military professionalism under civilian provocation requiring patience and legal restraint. Frank's transportation crisis approached resolution through military intervention that protected veteran rights while maintaining civilian-military cooperation necessary for community relationships requiring mutual respect between service members and law enforcement officials. Kane's forced compliance created resolution that validated Marine brotherhood while establishing precedent for civilian respect toward disabled veterans whose accommodation rights required protection from discriminatory enforcement by authority figures who lacked understanding of military sacrifice. His public apology acknowledged misconduct, while Frank's gracious acceptance demonstrated Marine character that inspired respect from civilian witnesses who observed dignity under harassment by official authority figure whose behavior had violated both law and common decency. This Marine service deserves better treatment, Kane admitted, while his apology created educational moment for civilian observers about veteran sacrifice and accommodation needs that federal law protected through Americans with Disabilities Act and military preference policies. The breakthrough extended beyond individual resolution to establish community precedent for respecting disabled veterans while demonstrating military brotherhood effectiveness. When civilian authorities failed to provide appropriate treatment for service members whose sacrifice earned accommodation rather than harassment. Frank's van return enabled independence restoration, while Marine response proved that brotherhood obligations transcended civilian authority when disabled veterans faced discrimination requiring protective intervention through legal demonstration of military solidarity and unit cohesion. Kane's apology and van return restored Frank's independence while demonstrating civilian accountability for veteran harassment, creating precedent for respectful treatment of disabled service members whose sacrifice earned accommodation rights rather than discriminatory enforcement. The Marines' disciplined response influenced department policy regarding veteran interactions while establishing community standard for military respect that prevented similar harassment incidents through education and institutional accountability. Most importantly, Frank's dignity throughout confrontation inspired both military and civilian witnesses, proving that disabilities didn't diminish veteran worth, while Marine brotherhood provided protection when civilian authorities failed to respect service members appropriately through legal accommodation and professional courtesy. Frank's harassment and Marine response triggered immediate police department policy changes regarding veteran interactions with mandatory training about military sacrifice and disability rights that prevented discrimination against service members seeking legitimate accommodation. Kane received disciplinary action while department protocols established respectful procedures for disabled veteran encounters that recognized service-connected injuries rather than questioning legitimate accommodation needs. The incident influenced community awareness about disabled veteran challenges while demonstrating military brotherhood effectiveness in protecting members from civilian discrimination through coordinated response that maintained legal compliance while ensuring appropriate resolution. Local veterans organizations use the confrontation as educational opportunity about accommodation rights and military respect, creating awareness campaigns that improve civilian understanding of service-connected disabilities requiring support rather than suspicion from authority figures. Media coverage established precedent for veteran protection while inspiring similar responses throughout military communities whose brotherhood obligations required defending disabled members from civilian harassment that violated both civil rights and military honor codes, requiring mutual support regardless of circumstances. 2 years later, Frank's case influenced state legislation protecting disabled veterans from parking harassment, while establishing legal remedies for discrimination that civilian authorities might attempt against legitimate accommodation users whose military service earned protection. The Morrison Protocol became standard law enforcement training for veteran interactions, teaching civilian officers about military culture and service-connected disabilities that required respectful accommodation rather than suspicious enforcement that could violate civil rights and community relations. His incident influenced veteran advocacy organizations while demonstrating military brotherhood effectiveness in protecting disabled members through coordinated response that achieved resolution without violence while maintaining legal compliance and institutional respect. Marine Corps training incorporated lessons from the Phoenix response while establishing protocols for civilian-military cooperation when disabled veterans faced discrimination requiring protective intervention through appropriate channels that respected both military honor and civilian authority. The case influenced federal disability policy while proving that civilian discrimination against veterans could trigger military response that achieved accountability through proper channels rather than confrontational behavior that might compromise legal standing or community relationships. Frank evolved from private veteran managing disability challenges to recognized advocate whose dignity under harassment inspired community respect, while demonstrating that military bearing transcended physical limitations when courage and honor guided responses to civilian discrimination. His experience with harassment and brotherhood response strengthened military identity, while proving that Marine loyalty provided protection when civilian authorities failed to respect veteran sacrifice through appropriate accommodation and professional courtesy. Military service creates bonds that civilian harassment cannot break. Frank often explains to veteran groups, brotherhood means never facing discrimination alone when proper support enables dignity and independence despite disabilities that service created through protecting American freedom. Frank's story proves that military brotherhood transcends civilian authority when disabled veterans face discrimination while demonstrating that coordinated response can achieve accountability and respect. When individual courage meets collective support through legal methods that honor both service sacrifice and community relationships. Epilogue. Today, Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison continues his routine VA appointments without harassment, while his case became training material for police departments nationwide, learning to respect disabled veterans rather than questioning their legitimate accommodation needs. Officer Kane completed mandatory sensitivity training, and now volunteers with veteran organizations, having learned to appreciate military sacrifice through education rather than enforcement. The Marines who responded to Frank's crisis became local heroes, their disciplined intervention inspiring community respect for military brotherhood while establishing precedent for veteran protection that spread throughout military communities. Lieutenant Davis implemented department-wide veteran interaction protocols, while Colonel Patterson's advocacy influenced VA policy regarding patient protection from civilian harassment during medical visits. The Phoenix VA parking lot now features memorial plaques honoring disabled veterans, while Frank's story continues inspiring military units whose brotherhood obligations require protecting members from discrimination regardless of circumstances. The peaceful resolution demonstrated that civilian-military cooperation could achieve accountability through proper channels while maintaining mutual respect that strengthened community relationships rather than creating permanent conflict between authority figures and service members whose sacrifice earned dignity rather than suspicion. Frank's van still bears his Purple Heart license plate, now a symbol of veteran rights that civilian authorities learn to respect through education about military service and the courage required to defend principles that enable freedom for those who sometimes forget the cost of their liberty, until reminded by heroes who paid that price willingly and deserve recognition rather than harassment, when they seek the accommodation their sacrifice has earned through serving something greater than themselves.